Hey, we're really glad you're here. Thank you so much for tuning in and hanging out with us. If you've looked at the news or social media at all, you've likely seen George Floyd's name. On Monday, he was killed at the hands of cops. He was nonviolent, unarmed, and begging for help. It was filmed and the video has circulated on social media and it sparked a lot of controversy and conversation. In the US, Black Americans are 3 times more likely to be killed by cops than white Americans. And if you are a Black man, you have a 1 in 1,000 chance that you will be killed by the cops. I don't say this to immediately say that all cops are bad and terrible, and we will talk more about that as we go through this video. But just to say that we're going to take a look at the reality of our nation. And as a church, we believe that it is our job to speak up for people who experience injustice and to learn more about it. For me, though, as much as I want to use my voice for change, I also have realized that there's no way that I know everything, and there's a lot of experiences that I will never fully understand because I am not Black. So that's why I'm really thankful that we're going to get to have this conversation with Lauren and with Joel today, because I know that there is just always more that I can be learning and more that we all can be learning. And it's incredibly important to listen to people with these experiences who have the lived experience of things that I will never understand. If this is something that makes you uncomfortable, I would challenge you to sit in this more, because that's probably a sign that this is important. This is going to be a really amazing conversation and something that we really want you to hear. So thank you so much for tuning in and for listening to this, because I know that it's something that's really important.
All right. Thanks, Naya, for introing and opening us up. I'm really excited that this morning we have Lauren Francis here. Lauren and I, we met, I think, 2012, when I was a worship leader at Forest Home, and she was a staff dean, so she was in charge of caring for all of our emotional and spiritual well-being. And we started leading worship together. You might remember her from the reunion worship nights back when we were able to meet in person. And she also leads in Fellowship Hall, and she's worked at a bunch of different churches. Some of you guys have been to the Way Gathering that she helped produce, and so I guess what I'm saying is she's a Christian. We're just excited to have her today, to have this conversation about race and faith and racism, and just some caveats, some things I want to say as we go into this. Lauren does not speak on behalf of all Black people. Just like I don't speak on behalf of all white people, although some people think I do. So for this is her experience. It's what she's sharing. She's also just super intelligent. She's been to seminary and stuff like that. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I just wanted to say is, we don't have a police officer kind of present for this interview. I know that there's that perspective on it. Actually, though, Lauren has a really cool part of her story that she's going to talk about in a second. But we did talk to a couple of our friends who are in law enforcement, and we kind of integrated some of their comments within our questions today. And then I haven't really looked over Lauren's answers. This is really just I don't even know what she's going to say. This is a candid conversation. I feel like we were just talking before, and for a lot of us, we're kind of even afraid to have the conversation and don't know if we're going to say the right things. And so this is just a chance for us to be able to talk. I think it's awesome that we get to have that conversation today. So those are the caveats. We have those out of the way. And the first thing I just wanted to ask you, Lauren, is if you could fill us in a little bit on your story, kind of where you're coming from, any highlights that you have. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, so like Joel said, I'm a Christian. I have been my whole life. Grew up in the church. My dad was a pastor for a really long time when I was a kid, so I love Jesus. I've always loved him. As you can tell, I am mixed race, so I'm half Black, which is amazing, and then I'm also half everything else, so Hispanic, Spanish, Native American, white. I have some British genes, which I found that I was very excited about.
You found
I found them. No, thank you, Ancestry.com. I mean, I think a huge part of my story as it pertains to race is I always felt like I was, especially because I grew up in Orange County, so I always felt like I was too white to actually be Black. And like I said, I would, look at my family and be like, well, I'm not as dark as them, so I guess I'm not really Black. But then I would go to school, and I grew up in Huntington Beach, where there's very little diversity, and people would be like, oh, this is my Black friend Lauren, or Lauren's our Black, and so I'd be like, well, I guess they think I'm Black, so I guess I am. So it's just always this weird middle ground, which I think is actually really helpful, because it's made me feel like I can kind of communicate to two, or not even two, but to lots of different groups of people, and that I have authority because I been in their shoes in some way.
I feel like that's crazy. You're stuck in the middle. And we were just talking, Lauren's a 3 on the Enneagram.
Yep.
We're performers and want people's love and affection and approval. So that seems crazy that you're kind of feel like you're stuck between 2 different groups and what those expectations are.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
It's crazy. It is really crazy, but I think the older that I've gotten, the more okay I am with that. Like when I was young, it was really hard because like I said, I would always feel like, oh, I don't really fit in with like my Black friends, or I don't really fit in with, you know, even my like Hispanic friends. Like I just never felt like I was fully identifying with them, but I also very clearly did not fit in with my white friends, who was the majority of my friends, because like I said, I grew up in Huntington Beach. So it's like, it's a weird place, but as I've gotten older, like I said, I'm actually really grateful for that middle space.
Yeah.
I think.
And I know that your experience then is going to be different than someone who is in South Carolina or different states or even different parts of the world. So one of the questions, I know Naya was touching on this before, there's a lot of cases of police brutality, and one of the things I just wanted to know is, growing up, because of your context, what was your experience with law enforcement? What were you told as a kid? Like, what did you learn about police officers growing up, and how did that impact you?
Yeah, so it's like Joel said, I have kind of an interesting background. My dad was in law enforcement when I was really young. So before I was born, he was actually like a gang unit cop. I don't know what they're called. He's in the gang unit. And so he was in law enforcement. And then when I was a small child, he worked in probation, which basically is the people who care for and kind of check up on people who are released from prison, but they're still serving out their time. So he worked in probation. He was really high up in probation in Orange County. So we always grew up with like a very strong respect for law enforcement because, you know, my dad was in law enforcement. His friends were cops, and his friends were judges, and his friends were probation officers. And like, I always had like a respect for them. And growing up in Orange County, I mean, there's very little, and also it's 30 years ago, which makes me feel very old, but it just was a different time in the sense that like it wasn't so polarizing. Like, law enforcement, police officers, it wasn't like this polarizing thing. And maybe it's a super big privilege of me, or like I'm privileged to be able to say that because I grew up in Orange County, but like I just don't remember it ever being like a thing. And it was really interesting because I think it's also different for females and males. Like I asked both my brothers recently, I'm like, hey, what did dad tell you? Like, what was communicated to you about being darker skin toned? And, both of them were like, oh, well, he said, like, if you get pulled over, like, you need to be very careful about where your hands are. You need to be really respectful. And, they're like, but that's just like everyone should do that. and which is interesting because, yes, everyone should do that. But, like, I think a white person isn't going to necessarily like Joel, no offense, but if you get pulled over, I mean, you're really nervous anyway, so you might be really nervous, but like
they're gonna think
fundamentally, like, I don't think you're going to be like, okay, mental checklist, I need to keep my hands in place, I can't reach for anything, I can't, I need to, like, that is just a thing that I think people of color think about. So I would say, and I just had this conversation with my dad, like, the majority of cops are not bad. The majority of law enforcement have great integrity. They are protecting us. They're keeping us safe. They are not in the news because they're actually doing their job. But we see, the cops that make really fatal mistakes, and like that is what is inundated. So it's really hard, I think, for even high schoolers, like, where do you get your news from? You get your news from Facebook, from Snapchat, from wherever. Like, you're going to see one side of the story. And so I think it's this, I'm constantly wrestling with, like, man, I'm really mad that this police officer did something so horrible. And that's happened multiple times. I'm really mad. But I also think about my brother and think about the people that I do know that are in law enforcement that are incredible people. And I'm like, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, if that makes sense. And there's I think that's why we just all have to be really gracious, not ignorant, not apathetic, not just like, okay, whatever, like, I don't want to care. But we have to remember, like, even in talking to my dad, this conversation is probably going differently because of my conversation with him. rather than me just coming in here fresh off of my Facebook feed and fresh off of all these articles, you know. So yeah, I think it's like a really nuanced conversation, but ultimately God's heart is for justice, for everyone. So any act of injustice is not of his heart.
Yeah, and I was just talking to someone about this. There could even be police officers that, they're not emotionally fit, and honestly, if they weren't a cop, they probably would have been a serial killer or something. And so it's hard to know, when are things racially motivated? When is it just this person is just mentally unstable? And so there's a lot of nuance that you're talking about. One of the things that I'm trying to figure out, because I mean, we all saw kind of all the outrage on social media, and I know a lot of people in high school group were posting about it, and I have this tension in me where I feel like I want to post something and I want to be angry and I want to, I don't want to be angry. I feel that anger and I want it to do something, but then also kind of like what you're saying is, like, I tend to trust law enforcement. I mean, based off of me being white in my perspective, I tend to trust them and think that I trust the system, the judicial system, it's all going to work out. They'll figure it out. So like, I want to respond quickly and to make a statement, but then there's this also like, I also want to hold back and wait for the facts. And I don't even know what the answer is to that, but I feel like a lot of us have felt that tension, you know?
Yeah, I think it's really important to, especially in the age of social media, it's really important to have a balanced conversation. So for me, I surround myself generally with people that love me, encourage me, support me, are for me. When I post something about racial injustice, the majority of messages that I get are loving and we stand with you. We're in this with you. How can we help? How can we pray for you? Whatever. But there are those people that have questions. They have their reservations. They challenge me. They say, okay, but have you ever thought of it this way? Some of those people are people of color. Some of those people are my family members, like my dad and my brother, So I feel like I always approach it like I want to have a balanced conversation. I want to do balanced research. I don't just want to go, and I'm not going to name any specific things, but I don't just go to one website and that's all my facts. Or, on the other side of the spectrum, I don't just, listen to this news station and that's all my facts. I think the best gift we can give ourselves is having a balanced understanding.
Yeah, and I think that we've last week, Brooke Kerr, she gave this, she was talking about the grief cycle too, and I think that there's some of that plays into how people respond on social media, like anger and blaming and sad. Like there's people react, and you were even saying this before, is that you have to honor people where they're at and their reactions. Can you speak any more to kind of what you're saying with that?
I'm a words person. I believe that words matter, and so I would just encourage, especially high schoolers, because I know I worked with high schoolers for a long time, and I know that sometimes high schoolers are just very quick to speak, which is great. I love, you're just ready. You're just there, and you're like, here's what I feel. That's incredible. I don't lose that. But also remember that those words have an impact. So those things that you're saying influence your friends, and then your friends' words are going to influence their friends. So if you're saying something that you hear from this other random person, or your parent's friend, or your parent's news channel or whatever, think about it yourself first before you post it.
So one of the things that I've been thinking about when it comes to this conversation is that the farther we are away from something, the simpler it appears.
Yeah.
So we've all had that situation where our friend has a problem with their family, and we're like, why don't you just do this and just tell them this? And if you are someone has a relationship problem and you're trying to fix it, it just seems so simple in your mind. And then the closer you get to it and the more you hear about it, the more you realize it's complex. And so I know that there's been a lot of simplistic answers given to complex stuff that's going on. And so one of the things that I've heard even our police officer friends say, and they really want people to get this, is that really what they want to do when they come into a situation is they want to control the situation and they want to de-escalate. And they say, just listen to everything that we say, and if you don't like what we did at the end, you can just write us up. I've heard that answer given, but it kind of seems like one of those simplistic answers where it might be a little more complicated.
People think it's as simple as if black people followed instructions, they wouldn't get shot. That's not true. We see it because people of color have followed instructions. People of color have not even been committing a crime, period, zero crime, and has still been killed. So it's not as simplistic as that. And like I said, it really depends on the police officer. So a really great police officer is not going to have that inner, like, ooh, I want to get a rise out of this person of color. They're not going to have that. My brother isn't going to have that. But a cop who has their issues is going to have that. And the sad thing is that usually that happens a few times, and there's complaints and there's files and there's things that are stacking up against this. And unfortunately, the justice system is a little skewed, and it just says like a lot of times in a lot of cities and a lot of counties, a blind eye is turned to that. So it's definitely not as simple as just behave and you won't get in trouble, or you won't get killed. I mean, realistically, that's what we're talking about. So it is a little simplistic, but
something that, because I heard you say this and I really appreciated it. Yeah, just us tapping into just our normal response. Like if a cop were to pull us over, right, we're already kind of anxious and there's already that stuff that's going on. But then kind of back to one of your first answers that you had when you were talking about your brother being told that he needed to keep his hands in the car and all that kind of stuff. Like, I don't know about you guys, but like, what did your parents tell you about cops, like growing up? Like my parents just said, when you get pulled over, don't stand in the middle of the street so you don't get hit by a car. Like, they just like, they're like, they're going to give you a ticket and then you're going to go. Like,
my parents told me cry and you'll get out of it.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay.
But something that's been really helpful for me to understand this, if your whole life you've kind of been told, okay, don't mess this up, don't say anything, don't escalate it. And you've been told that as a kid growing up, and you've kind of been given that worst case scenario. When you are pulled over, your brain goes into kind of a trauma response because there's been those little T trauma moments in your past, and so you tap into that. Your amygdala takes over, and your fight-flight response, and so even sometimes the way you react with fleeing or being frustrated or angry, like those are sometimes really hard to control. So that's been kind of helpful just in me understanding that experience. Okay, so we've seen by now, if you've been on social media or looking at the news, there's been a ton of rioting, violence, even people taking out these violent acts on neighbors and businesses that may or may not have had anything to do with the actual police brutality that happened. And so we've seen a lot of this hatred and violence, and I feel like that's taking action, that's not just shutting down and doing nothing, but I don't know, is there a third way forward, I guess, for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think of the idea, and it's probably from the Bible, I can't quote the verse, so sorry, but like evil met with evil does not produce good. Like an act of evil, so in this case, an act of, stealing and, just ruining stuff, like that's not what any person would say, like, oh, that's the acceptable response. Now, most people would say that it's coming from a place of anger and a place of frustration and a place of not feeling heard, and so there's a lot to unpack there. But like fundamentally, like I don't think that an evil act is the best answer. But I think that there is absolutely a third way. I think that's continuing to speak out, continuing to be a voice for those who cannot have a voice. So, I say this to white people, like very candidly, like you have a platform and you have a voice to other white people that may not see a problem in the world, that may not have any, like they don't see any injustice. They're just in their own world, especially in Orange County. Like I grew up here, so I have tons of friends that are like, racism isn't real. Like nobody, injustice doesn't matter. Like, that's only in the South or that's only in Florida or wherever. But it's like, no, it is here. And so if you are watching this and if you are like, okay, well, I'm not going to like join a riot, which I don't think you should, but what can I do? Like, you can use your voice and use your platform to speak to other people who may never like understand the same, or not even may never, but who don't at this point understand the things that you understand, and you can help them understand and say like, hey, I think we should ask questions, or I think we should read this book. Just go on Instagram, period, and click on anyone's link. Like I guarantee you one of your friends will have shared it. If not, you can follow me. books, movies, articles, people to follow, Twitter feeds, all of these things, like these are resources for you to educate yourself. That's honestly the best gift that I could ask for, like from a person who's not a person of color. Like the best thing that I could ask for is that you would educate yourselves and you would be able to speak out. And yeah, there's just no excuse. Like there's literally no excuse, especially in this moment, because everybody is sharing. And
I think that was interesting that you were saying that some people are having a hard time thinking that racism exists, and we're Christians, and so we're talking about this as from a Christian worldview and perspective. We believe that fundamentally the world is broken, and there's brokenness, and at the root of racism is sin, and it's pride, and it's self-righteousness, and it's I'm better than you, and as long as sin exists in the world, there will always be people, and there's always moments in our own heart where we think we're better than someone else because of our upbringing, because of our experiences, because of what we've done and what we've done with our life. So that is going to exist. That's a part of our worldview. So we should assume that we're going to be doing that.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of the sad thing. This will always exist among us in some form, and it has to be a continuous thing that we're finding and calling out. And I think it's important to find it and call it out in our own hearts. If you want to see the world change, let's see our heart change. And so it's easy for us to point fingers at other people, and sometimes that's because we're afraid of even looking at our own heart and what could be there. So that's...
Yeah.
The other question, Sammy's here, and this is just Sammy Gayer's idea to do this whole thing. And she just had a good question about like wanting to do something. And I feel like a lot of us have felt like, hey, we don't want to be the people who just post on social media and feel good about ourselves for a second and feel self-righteous about ourselves for a second, and then we just go on and don't do anything else. What can we actually do besides just posting something?
Yeah, I think it's great. I think the number one thing I would say is listen, stop talking. And I don't want to be like crass about this, but like if you're a white person, like just stop talking right now. Like just quiet for a little bit, listen, intake what other people are saying. Like you're doing a great job. Listen to what I am saying right now, and then like you're learning and you're hearing another perspective, and you're not just in your own brain of like, this is my experience, this is right, this is the world. Like you're outside of your experience. And that can only happen for all of us. Like there's so many times when I have to just stop talking and I have to listen. Like I have to just remove myself from the conversation with all my opinions for a brief amount of time and just learn. And then I can engage in the conversation in a meaningful way, and in a more meaningful way. So I would say listen, learn, super practically, like mourn with those who are mourning. So like the best thing that people did for me was message me and say, hey, I don't know how you're feeling. I don't know what to say, but I'm with you. I love you. I see you. I hear you. And so to me, that is a huge thing. Like mourn with those who are mourning, stand with those who are mourning. That's like from the Bible. It's not just my opinion. Like we are called to mourn with those who are mourning. And then fourth, I would say, Joel, like what you said, like look in the mirror, like, and I said, like, mourn yourself. Like, understand that there's probably times that you have done something in your life that stems from a place of just deep-seated, like, injustice. There's probably a time in your life, and it doesn't just have to be with people of color. It can be with people in a lower socioeconomic class. It can be with people who are differently abled than you, whatever it looks like. Like, take a look in the mirror and say, I realize that I've done this. I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry. God, like cleanse me of my, like it sounds super cheesy, but like chances are you've done that. I have to do that all the time. So it's not just people of color, but, or it's not just towards people of color, but this, I also don't want to sound crass, but like if you look around your friend group and everyone looks like you, like you should probably diversify your friend group. Like, like it sounds super like weird, like stop telling me to be friends with, but like if you only have friends that are exactly the same as you, then you're only gonna experience life in a certain way, and like that's just not fun. I mean, like at a very surface level it's not fun, but at a very like deep fundamental level, like it's not healthy. So I always feel like super super excited when I look around and I'm like, everyone's different. Like, this is so cool. There's so many different experiences. And so, yeah, I mean, if you don't have people that don't look like you in your life, and I don't even just mean color, like I said, I mean differently abled, different socioeconomic class, obviously different skin colors, but different ages even, like just make sure you're not in your vortex with your 5 friends that all look like you and you all are the exact same and like you're twins of each other. Like as you grow older, that's not going to serve you well.
And we talked about this on Wednesday. The beauty of the church is that the church isn't centered around a political agenda or a race or whatever. It's centered around Christ, right? And just so you know, this isn't foreign territory. Actually, in the first century, there were 5 groups. There weren't 2 groups that were kind of going at it with division. There were the Jews who thought they were better than everybody. There were the Gentiles who hated the Jews because the Jews thought they were awesome, right? And then there were the slaves who were slaves, and there were freedmen who were former slaves and had like purchased their freedom or who had worked really hard to be able to get out of it, and the slave owners never thought that they were actually worthy of being freedmen, whatever. And then there are women who had 0 rights, right? So there's 5 groups, and it's like a funny joke, like they all show up at a party, right? They all show up at the church in the first century. It's crazy. And one of the founders of the church, Peter, it's 15 years after Jesus has rose from the dead, and he still hates Gentiles. He still feels like Gentiles are lesser than and unworthy. And God basically calls him out of a daydream that he's having and says, go hang out with this Gentile Cornelius. And he's afraid to go in, but basically he ends up going into Cornelius' home, and he confesses to Cornelius that God has changed his heart, and now he sees that it doesn't matter if you're Gentile or you're Jewish. It just matters if you're one in Christ. And actually, Paul says that when he says there's neither slave nor free, Jew nor Gentile, man or woman. Not that those distinctions go away. It's not that like you're not black and I'm not white anymore. But there is a deeper identity now that can connect us, which is the gospel. And then 5 years later, in Acts 15, those 2 groups, the Jews and the Gentiles, they actually come together, and they actually they make concessions about cultural differences. And the reason you have the gospel today is because 2 groups came together. And so we exist because this has happened. So there's hope. So a lot of people are like, well, Lauren and Joel talked about it, and it's never going to change. And like people learn what their parents taught them, and like there's no growth. No, we've seen this. There is hope because the gospel is able to do it. And for me, I don't think there's a political party that's going to be able to do this. I think the church is going to be the one that's going to be able to bring people back together. And we've seen it done before. Again, those 5 groups that come together because of the gospel. So there is hope. So it's not just, we're hearing about this again or something. But that's just what I wanted to end on. Is there anything else for you as a Christian, or maybe for us? Like, we're at a predominantly white church. We're probably more diverse than we've been, but we're not nearly where we probably should be. What would you say for us? Is there anything else you would encourage us in?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to leave, obviously, end with a reminder that all of this is biblical. All of this is in Scripture. Like Joel said, we're all one in Christ. It's, in Galatians. And so that's like one of our fundamental beliefs. Another is that we're supposed to love God and love our neighbor. Your neighbor isn't necessarily the person that looks like you, so your neighbor could very well be someone of a different whatever, fill in the blank. You're supposed to love them. Loving them means caring for them. Loving them means honoring them, dignifying them, not considering them less than. That's biblical. It's in Matthew. But the thing that really, the 2 that actually really get me are just John 13:35. It says, the world will know that you are my children by your love for one another. Like, what does the world see when they see a bunch of Christians either A, being silent, or B, furthering like hateful speech or racist speech or whatever? Like, what does the world see? That we are we are the mirrors of Jesus. And so like, what does that communicate to the world? Like, let that sink in. And then lastly, I love this verse. This has like been my mantra during this whole thing. Like, when anyone comes for me and says like, this isn't biblical, like you need to read your Bible again, blah, 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 I just quote them this and drop the mic. It's Proverbs 31:8-9. It says, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Ensure justice for those being crushed. Yes, speak up for the poor, the helpless, and see that they get justice. So I love that the word is crushed in here. I also hate it because it's too real. But we are supposed to speak up for those who cannot speak up for themselves. That is biblical. That's in Proverbs. That's even before the New Testament church went through all of this, division. Like, that is a pearl of wisdom that we are given in the Old Testament. So I just want us to remember that, like, biblically speaking, like, this is our call. This is our command. At the end of our lives, do we want to stand in front of Jesus and say, I, like, think that I loved everybody, and, like, I think that I was fair, and, like, I think that I did? Or do we want to say, like, I loved people, I stood up for them when bad stuff happened to people that they didn't deserve it, I spoke out, I used my voice, I talked to my friends, I had those conversations. We want to stand in front of Jesus and be able to say that, not just about racial injustice, but about so many injustices in the world. And I feel like the earlier that we can get that, like, in our brains, the better lives we will have, and the better capacity that we'll have to love others.
Yeah, Lauren, thanks for joining us. Guys, thanks for watching this and for going through it. I feel like sometimes the reaction to some of these things are pulling out facts and just doing fact bombs back and forth. When you start to get close and when you actually talk to people, facts don't work. People's real stories and their heart is what we need to be listening to. So that's what Jesus would do. Jesus would enter in, he would go in, and he'd be present. So that's the big thing that I'm hearing, a good takeaway from this conversation. So well, we love you guys. You are the light of the world. You are Jesus on display. So let's continue to live into that and be about what Jesus wants us to.